What happens when the most arrogant hospital CEO in the city humiliates a broke single father in front of a dying child, never imagining that the quiet man in the worn-out jacket could buy her entire hospital with a single phone call? Marcus Reed had spent 3 years hiding the truth about who he really was, but by morning, Vivian Cross would learn that some men don't need to raise their voice to bring an empire to its knees. Rain hammered against the sliding glass doors of St. Augustine Medical Center as Marcus Reed burst through them, carrying his 8-year-old son Eli in his arms. The boy's small body was burning with fever, his breathing shallow and ragged, his lips tinged a faint, terrifying blue. Marcus's flannel shirt was soaked through, his work boots tracking mud across the polished marble floor of the hospital's grand lobby, a lobby that looked more like a 5-star hotel than a place where sick children were supposed to be saved. "I need help! Please, somebody help my son!" Marcus's voice cracked, raw with 3 years of exhaustion and fear compressed into a single moment. A nurse rushed forward, her eyes widening at the sight of the unconscious boy. "What happened? How long has he been like this?" "He has a congenital heart defect," Marcus said, his words tumbling out fast. "It's getting worse. His pediatrician said if his oxygen levels drop any further, he needs emergency surgery tonight, not next week, not after some insurance review, tonight." The nurse called for a gurney, and within seconds Eli was being wheeled toward the emergency wing, machines and staff swarming around him. Marcus tried to follow, but a security guard's arm came up like a steel bar across his chest. "Sir, you need to check in at admissions first." "My son is dying," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made the guard hesitate. "I am not filling out paperwork while he's back there alone." It was at that exact moment that the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby chimed open, and Vivian Cross stepped out. At 34, Vivian was the youngest hospital network CEO in the state, having inherited St. Augustine and 4 sister facilities from her father 2 years prior. She wore a cream-colored Stella McCartney blazer that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and she carried herself with the brisk, untouchable confidence of someone who had never once had to wonder if a doctor would actually see her. She had been on her way to a late-night board call about quarterly margins when the commotion in the lobby caught her attention. She frowned at the mud tracked across her hospital's pristine floor, at the soaked, disheveled man arguing with her security staff. "What is going on here?" Vivian asked, approaching with the clipped authority of someone who expected immediate answers. "Ma'am, this man came in without prior intake, demanding immediate surgical attention for his son," the guard explained. Vivian's sharp green eyes swept over Marcus, taking in the cracked work boots, the faded jacket with a logo from some auto shop stitched onto the chest, the desperate, hollow look in his eyes. She had seen this exact look 100 times before. Parents who walked in expecting miracles they couldn't pay for. "Sir, I understand this is frightening," Vivian said, her tone polished but cold, the voice of someone reciting a script she'd recited 1,000 times. "But St. Augustine is a private facility. Emergency cardiac surgery on a pediatric patient runs upward of $200,000 before recovery costs. I need to know how you intend to cover that before my surgical team can even begin a consult." "I don't care what it costs," Marcus said. "Just save him. We can sort out the money after." Vivian's lips pressed into a thin, practiced line. "I wish it worked that way, but it doesn't. We've had families walk away with bills they could never repay, and frankly, this hospital cannot operate on good intentions." She glanced again at his clothes, and something in her expression hardened into open condescension. "You'll never afford this hospital. I'd suggest County General. They have a sliding payment scale for situations like yours." The words landed like a slap. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, a quiet, dangerous stillness that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "My son could die in the time it takes to drive across town," he said quietly. "Then I suggest you hurry," Vivian replied, already turning back toward the elevator, already moving on to the next item on her agenda, already forgetting his face. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, watching the elevator doors close on the woman who had just turned away his dying son over a number on a balance sheet. Then he did the only thing he could. He pulled out his phone, walked to a quiet corner of the lobby, and made a call he had sworn 3 years ago he would never make again. "Sebastian," he said when the line connected, his voice low and tight, "I need you to activate the Halworth Trust, tonight." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, are you certain? Once that's triggered, your position can no longer stay hidden." "I don't care anymore," Marcus said, staring down the hallway where his son had disappeared. "Get Dr. Amelia Cho from Boston Children's on a private jet within the hour. Buy out whatever surgical suite she needs. And Sebastian, pull every file St. Augustine has on its billing practices for the last 5 years. I want to know exactly how many families that woman just turned away." To understand how Marcus Reed ended up standing in a hospital lobby being told he was too poor to save his own son, you have to go back 3 years, to the night that changed everything. Marcus had not always worn flannel shirts and worked 60-hour weeks at Reed Auto Repair, a modest shop he'd bought to keep his hands busy and his head down. Before that, he had been Marcus Halworth, founder and majority shareholder of Halworth Dynamics, a private equity and healthcare infrastructure conglomerate that quietly owned stakes in over 200 hospitals and clinics across the country, including, though almost no one alive knew it, a minority position in St. Augustine Medical Center itself. Marcus had built Halworth Dynamics from nothing, starting with a single medical billing software company he'd coded in his college dorm room, and growing it over 15 years into one of the most powerful, deliberately invisible empires in American healthcare. He had never sought fame. He preferred his name stay off the headlines while his money quietly reshaped industries. Then his wife Sarah was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. For 18 months, Marcus had thrown the full weight of his empire at finding a cure, funding experimental trials, flying in specialists from 4 continents. None of it had been enough. Sarah passed away when Eli was 5 years old, and something in Marcus broke that money could never fix. In the wreckage of his grief, Marcus realized a brutal truth. He had spent his entire adult life building wealth and had been entirely, catastrophically absent from his sons. He made a decision that horrified his board and his lawyers in equal measure. He stepped down from active leadership of Halworth Dynamics, placed the company under the management of his most trusted lieutenant, Sebastian Cole, and disappeared. He took only Eli, a modest savings account, and his late father's old surname, Reed, and rebuilt a life in obscurity. He bought a struggling auto repair shop in a working-class neighborhood 3 states away from his old life. And for 3 years, he was simply Marcus Reed, a single dad who fixed transmissions and made his son pancakes shaped like dinosaurs on Sunday mornings. He had never once regretted the choice. Until tonight, when his disguise nearly cost his son his life. By the time Marcus walked back into the surgical waiting area, his face was calm again, but something fundamental had shifted behind his eyes. A nurse approached him, looking confused. "Mr. Reed, I'm sorry, there's been some kind of mix-up. Dr. Patel just got a call from administration. They're saying a Dr. Amelia Cho is being flown in from Boston, and the chief surgical suite is being cleared immediately, no questions asked. Do you know anything about that?" Marcus simply nodded. "He's my son. I made some calls." The nurse stared at him as if trying to reconcile the mud on his boots with whatever was suddenly happening on the hospital's internal systems, but she didn't ask further. Within the hour, Dr. Amelia Cho, one of the foremost pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country, arrived by private car directly to the surgical entrance, her team already briefed and ready. Vivian Cross was pulled out of her board call at 11:45 that night by a frantic message from her chief of staff. Her phone buzzed relentlessly until she finally answered. "Vivian, you need to come down to administration, now." "I'm in the middle of the Hargrove acquisition call. This had better be important." "Someone just activated emergency clearance for a pediatric surgical suite using executive-level credentials we didn't even know existed in our system. They flew in a surgeon from Boston in under an hour. The order came through under a name I don't recognize. Howarth." Vivian's stomach dropped. The name Howarth was not unfamiliar to her. Howarth Dynamics held a minority equity stake in St. Augustine, a stake so deeply buried in the hospital's ownership structure that even Vivian, the CEO, had only seen it once, in a single line item on a financial disclosure document years ago. It was supposed to be a silent, passive investment. It had never once exercised any operational authority in the 2 years she had run the hospital. "That's impossible," Vivian said, already grabbing her coat. "Howarth has never even sent a representative to a board meeting." "Well, someone representing them just overrode our surgical scheduling system, Vivian. And there's something else. They've requested a full audit of our billing department's denial records going back 5 years. By the time Vivian reached the administration wing, her chest tight with a rising, unfamiliar panic, she found a man waiting in the hallway outside the executive boardroom. He was no longer wearing the soaked flannel shirt from earlier. He wore a simple charcoal sweater and dark jeans, still casual, still understated, but there was something different in the way he stood now. A stillness, a quiet command that made the hospital's senior staff part around him like water around a stone. "You," Vivian said, stopping in her tracks, recognition and confusion warring across her face. "You're the man from the lobby, the one I told to go to County General." "Marcus Reed," he said evenly. "Though that's not entirely accurate either. My full name is Marcus Halworth." The blood drained from Vivian's face. "Halworth, as in the Halworth Trust that holds a 14% equity stake in this hospital, yes," Marcus said. "Though I imagine you've never seen that stake do anything before tonight, because I made a promise to myself 3 years ago to never interfere in operations. I broke that promise about 2 hours ago, the moment you told a desperate father his son's life wasn't worth your hospital's time unless he could prove he could pay for it first." Vivian opened her mouth, searching for the practiced corporate language that had never once failed her, the language of liability and protocol and standard procedure. But for the first time in her professional life, nothing came out. "My son is in your operating room right now," Marcus continued, his voice never rising, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he had shouted. "Dr. Cho tells me the surgery will take approximately 6 hours. I intend to spend every one of those hours going through the 5 years of billing denial records I requested. Records, Ms. Cross, that I have reason to believe will show a pattern of turning away exactly the kind of families you assumed I was tonight." "Mr. Halworth, I had no idea who you were," Vivian said, her voice tightening with the first edge of genuine fear. "If I had known—" "That's precisely the problem," Marcus cut in, and for the first time something sharp flickered behind his calm exterior. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat a child with respect. You looked at my boots and my jacket and decided my son's life mattered less than your bottom line. That's not a mistake born of ignorance, Ms. Cross. That's a policy. And tonight, I intend to find out exactly how deep it runs." Vivian's chief financial officer, a nervous man named Gerald Whitfield, appeared at the end of the hallway, practically jogging, a tablet clutched to his chest. "Vivian, I pulled the preliminary numbers you asked for. It's not good. Show me, Vivian said tightly. Gerald hesitated, glancing at Marcus. He stays, Vivian said. He apparently owns part of this hospital. Gerald swallowed and turned the tablet toward them. The screen displayed a dense spreadsheet, rows of red highlighted entries stretching back years. Over the past 5 years, St. Augustine's billing department has denied or delayed emergency intervention for 211 pediatric cases pending upfront payment verification. Of those, internal incident reports show that at least 19 resulted in significant medical deterioration before treatment was eventually authorized. 3 resulted in patient death before transfer to another facility could be completed. The hallway went silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Vivian's face had gone the color of paper. "That policy predates my tenure," Vivian said quietly, almost to herself. "My father implemented the upfront verification protocol to protect the hospital from bad debt after a string of bankruptcies nearly closed us down. I never thought to revisit it." "You never thought to revisit a policy that costs children their lives because it was inherited rather than chosen?" Marcus said. "That's not an excuse, Ms. Cross. That's an indictment." Vivian's jaw tightened, old instincts of corporate defense rising even through her shock. "With respect, Mr. Hallworth, you stepped away from this company entirely. You can't simply reappear after 3 years of silence and claim the moral high ground over decisions you weren't here to influence." For the first time, something close to respect flickered in Marcus's eyes. She wasn't groveling. She was fighting back, even cornered, even terrified. It told him something about her he hadn't expected to see. "You're right that I stepped away," Marcus said. "That was my failure, and I own it. But I'm here now, and I have 2 options in front of me, Ms. Cross. I can liquidate the Hallworth Trust's position in this hospital tomorrow morning, sell my stake to a competitor who will likely strip this place for parts, and walk away from St. Augustine entirely. Or you and I can spend the rest of tonight rebuilding the policy that almost let my son die in a hallway." Vivian stared at him for a long moment, the weight of the choice settling over her. 6 hours earlier, she had dismissed this man without a second glance. Now, her hospital's future and her own career rested on whatever decision she made in the next 30 seconds. "Show me the data," Vivian said finally, straightening her shoulders. "All of it. Every denied case. I want names, not just numbers." It was not the answer Marcus had expected, and something in his posture eased, just slightly. They worked through the night in the executive boardroom, Gerald pulling files, Vivian reading every denial report with an intensity that bordered on obsession, occasionally pressing her palm against her mouth when a case detail proved particularly damning. Marcus watched her work, noting that she didn't flinch from the worst of it, didn't try to spin the numbers or bury the failures in corporate language. She read every name out loud, as if forcing herself to remember each one. Around 3 in the morning, a nurse appeared in the boardroom doorway. "Mr. Reed, Dr. Cho is finished. Your son is in recovery. The surgery was a complete success." Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment, the tension of the night finally breaking. "Can I see him?" "Of course." Vivian stood as Marcus rose to leave. "Mr. Hallworth, wait." He paused at the door. "Whatever you decide to do with your stake in this hospital, I want you to know that I am implementing a new policy starting tonight. No pediatric patient is ever turned away or delayed pending payment verification again. I don't care what it costs the hospital. I will find the money elsewhere before I let what almost happened to your son happen to one more family." Marcus studied her for a moment. "Talk is easy at 3 in the morning when you're frightened, Miss Cross. I'll be watching to see if it holds up at 9. Eli woke up the next afternoon in a private recovery suite, groggy but breathing easily for the first time in months, the dangerous blue tint gone from his lips. Marcus sat beside the bed, holding his son's small hand, when a soft knock came at the door. Vivian stood in the doorway, no longer in her boardroom blazer, but in simple slacks and a blouse, looking exhausted but resolute. She held a folder in her hands. "I'm not here as the CEO," she said quietly. "I'm here because I wanted to see for myself that he's all right." Marcus gestured her inside. Eli blinked sleepily at the new visitor. "Is that the lady from the elevator?" Vivian's composure cracked slightly. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took me so long to let your dad bring you back here." "It's okay," Eli mumbled, already drifting back toward sleep. "Dad fixes things. He probably fixed you too." Vivian let out a startled, wet laugh, blinking back unexpected tears. She handed Marcus the folder. "This is the new emergency intervention protocol. Effective immediately, no upfront payment verification for any pediatric or life-threatening case. I've also established a foundation fund using a portion of my personal shares to cover treatment costs for families who can't pay. I called it the Eli Fund, if that's all right with you." Marcus looked through the documents slowly, genuinely surprised by the thoroughness of what she'd assembled in less than 12 hours. "This is more than I expected." "It's the least I could do," Vivian said. "I spent the night reading the names of 19 children my hospital failed because of a policy I never questioned. I don't get to undo that, but I can make sure it never happens again." She hesitated. "Are you going to liquidate your stake?" Marcus closed the folder, considering her carefully. "No," he said finally. "I think St. Augustine needs someone who actually built it back from a mistake, rather than someone who simply walks away from one. I'd like to formalize my position on the board, openly this time. And I'd like you to remain as CEO, Ms. Cross, on the condition that the Eli Fund becomes permanent policy across all 5 hospitals in the network, not just this one." Vivian's eyes widened. "You're not firing me?" "I considered it," Marcus admitted. "But firing you would just hand this hospital to someone who never had to look 19 names in the eye and feel what you felt last night. I'd rather keep the person who actually changed because of it." Over the following weeks, the unlikely partnership between Marcus Halworth and Vivian Cross transformed St. Augustine's network in ways neither of them could have predicted. Vivian threw herself into the work with a relentlessness that surprised even her own staff, personally reviewing every denial case from the past 5 years and tracking down families who had been turned away, offering apologies, coverage, and in several cases, long overdue corrective care. Marcus, for his part, found himself drawn back into a world he'd sworn off 3 years earlier, not as the reclusive billionaire hiding behind a trust fund, but as someone actively shaping how that wealth could be used to fix the very system that had nearly failed his son. He brought Eli with him to the hospital often during follow-up visits, and slowly, the boy who had once seen a cold marble lobby as the place that almost took his life began to see it instead as the place his father had quietly rebuilt. The transformation did not happen without resistance. 3 weeks into the new protocol, Vivian found herself in a heated confrontation with Gerald Whitfield and 2 senior board members in a closed conference room. Men who had served under her father for decades and who viewed the abolition of upfront payment verification as financial recklessness dressed up as compassion. "You're going to bankrupt this network within 18 months, argued Harold Briggs, the longest-serving board member, slapping a printed projection onto the table. "Bad debt write-offs are already up 30% since the policy changed. The Eli Fund is a feel-good headline, Vivian, not a sustainable model. The Eli Fund is backed by a private equity commitment from the Halworth Trust that exceeds our entire bad debt exposure for the next decade," Vivian replied evenly. "I've seen the figures, Harold. Have you?" "I've seen enough to know that a single benefactor's goodwill is not a business strategy. What happens when Mr. Halworth loses interest? What happens when his next crisis of conscience points him somewhere else entirely?" It was a fair question, and Vivian knew it. She had asked herself the same thing more than once during sleepless nights spent rebuilding 5 years of broken policy from scratch. But she had also spent those same nights reading the name of a 7-year-old girl named Daniela Ruiz, denied a transfusion for 11 hours while her family scrambled to produce an insurance card, and a 17-year-old boy named Tyler Okafor, whose appendix ruptured in a waiting room while administration verified his mother's payment plan. She had read those names enough times that the abstract math Harold kept waving in front of her no longer carried the same weight it once had. "Then I suppose we'll have to make sure the model works even without him," Vivian said. "Because I'm not reverting this policy, Harold. Not for you, not for the shareholders, and not for the next quarterly call. If this board wants to remove me over it, you're welcome to try. But I'd suggest you read the 19 incident reports in that binder first, and then tell me to my face that 30% is too high a price." The room went quiet. Harold did not bring up the projection again, but Vivian understood that the fight over the hospital's soul had only just begun, and that money alone, even Marcus's money, would not be enough to win it. What it would take was proof. Sustained, undeniable proof that doing right by patients did not have to mean ruin for the institution. She found that proof 3 months later, when a regional healthcare quality report ranked St. Augustine first in the state for pediatric emergency outcomes, a jump from 11th the previous year, and patient volume in the children's wing rose by nearly 20% as word spread through the community that the hospital no longer turned families away at the door. Donations to the Eli Fund, initially seeded by Marcus's trust, began arriving from grateful former patients, several of whom had been on that very list of denied cases. Marcus watched the numbers climb with a quiet satisfaction that surprised him. He had spent 15 years building Howarth dynamics around the cold logic of growth and return, and only now, watching a struggling single hospital prove that compassion could be made structurally sound rather than charitably optional, did he feel something like genuine pride in the empire he'd built. There was, however, one final confrontation neither of them saw coming. Simon Ashford, the network's outgoing chief operating officer and Vivian's father's former protege, had been quietly furious since the night his old payment verification policy was dismantled, a policy he himself had drafted nearly a decade earlier and considered something close to his life's work. When the board voted to formally appoint Marcus as an active director and approve the expansion of the Eli Fund across all 5 hospitals, Simon requested a private meeting with Vivian, ostensibly to discuss a transition plan for his own departure. "You understand what you've done, don't you?" Simon said, his voice tight with barely contained resentment as he stood in Vivian's office, the city skyline glittering behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You've handed control of your father's life's work to a man who disappeared for 3 years and reappeared with a checkbook. He'll lose interest. They always do. And when he does, you'll be the one left holding together a network that can no longer say no to anyone." "My father built a hospital that turned away 19 children," Vivian said quietly. "I'm not interested in protecting that legacy, Simon. I'm interested in building a better one." "Sentiment," Simon scoffed. "You sound just like him now." "Good," Vivian said, "because the version of me that sounded like you is the one who almost let a little boy die in a hallway." Simon left without another word, submitting his resignation the following week. Vivian did not chase him down to change his mind. For the first time since taking over the network, she felt less like she was defending her father's inheritance and more like she was finally, deliberately, choosing what kind of leader she wanted to become. It was on one such visit, 2 months later, that Vivian found Marcus in the hospital's small rooftop garden, watching Eli chase a butterfly between rows of donated rose bushes, planted as part of the hospital's new family healing initiative. "I owe you an apology I haven't fully given yet," Vivian said, joining him at the railing. "Not the corporate one. The real one. You've apologized plenty, Marcus said. Not for the right thing, Vivian replied. I didn't just deny your son care because of a flawed policy. I looked at you and decided in about 4 seconds that you didn't matter. That's not a system failure, Marcus. That was me. I need you to know I understand the difference. Marcus turned to look at her properly for the first time in weeks, seeing past the CEO, past the guilt, to the woman who had spent 2 months systematically tearing down and rebuilding a flawed empire because one terrible mistake had finally forced her to look directly at the cost of her own assumptions. You're the only executive I've ever met who didn't try to talk her way out of being wrong, Marcus said quietly. That counts for more than you think. Below them, Eli's laughter carried up from the garden as he finally caught his butterfly, cupping it gently in his small hands before letting it go again, watching it lift into the open sky. Marcus watched his son with the particular ache of a father who had nearly lost everything. And beside him, Vivian watched the same boy with the quiet wonder of someone who had nearly let it happen and had been given, against every reasonable expectation, a second chance to be better. Neither of them said anything else that afternoon. They didn't need to. Somewhere between a hospital lobby on the worst night of their lives and a rooftop garden full of roses 2 months later, an arrogant CEO and a hidden billionaire had built something neither title could have predicted. A partnership grounded not in money or power, but in the simple, hard-won understanding that some mistakes are only redeemed by the work you do after them. If this story of hidden identities, second chances, and a father's love moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the people we judge too quickly are often carrying more than we could ever imagine. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, dramatic stories delivered straight to your feed every single week.